Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the most exciting session of the second week of the climate change meeting, Scaling Up Private Sector Climate Actions in Agriculture. So congratulations to making the right choice this afternoon. My name is Tony Simons. I'm the Director General of the World Agroforestry Centre, ICRAF, based in Nairobi, Kenya. And we'd like to start out with an experiment this afternoon, slightly unscheduled from the organisers. But we're going to start out with an experiment, and that is, there's many different ways you can vote. You can vote with your head, you can vote with your heart. Well, the organisers have pioneered a new voting system, and that is voting with your backside. So if everyone could stand up, please. The panel can stay seated. Oh,
we give the example.
Okay, so you only have one vote, and when you agree with the statement I'm going to say, you get to sit down. Okay, so sit down when you agree with the statement that I'd say. And we have a combination today of public sector and private sector actors. So we're just wanting to really classify ourselves. So please sit down if you would describe yourself as a capitalist. Okay, let me soften it a bit for you. Please sit down if you would describe yourself as someone who's trying to optimize and maximize returns to capital. Okay, let's soften it a bit more. Please sit down if you're somebody who's trying to optimize and maximize returns to social capital, natural capital, and financial capital. So you're all capitalists. And that just shows us a little bit of our biases and our prejudices. And this afternoon's session is intended to open up our minds to how we can engage through national government processes, through intergovernmental agencies, through stakeholder groups, with the private sector to scale up climate actions in agriculture. And boy, are you in for a treat this afternoon, because we've got a fantastic panel. We have His Excellency Luis Felipe Arauz Cavallini, who's the Minister of Agriculture and Livestock in Costa Rica. Welcome. We have also Margarita Estralaga, the Director of Environment and Climate Division at IFAD, the International Fund for Agriculture and Development. Next to the Minister, we have Her Excellency Fumelani Mashau, who's the Projects Officer at SACAL, the Southern Africa Confederation of Agricultural Unions. Sitting next to Fumelani, we have Matthew Reddy, who's the Director for Climate Smart Agriculture at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And lastly, and giving us most of our credibility for the topic this afternoon, we have Diane Holdorf, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer and Vice President from Kellogg Company. Welcome, Diane. So, so that we don't fall any more behind, can we please ask His Excellency Luis Felipe Arauz Cavallini to give us a few opening remarks and set the stage. Your Excellency.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you to the other panelists. Thank you to the audience and to the organizers for having me here. One of the points I would like to make is how would the private sector help to achieve the national determined contributions, how the private sector can contribute to mitigate greenhouse gases. And in order to do that, we need to wonder what moves the private sector. And the private sector, if private sector is investing money, they're expecting to make a profit, to create jobs, to create some kind of benefit, whether it be economic, social, or otherwise. But there has to be a benefit. there has to be a tangible benefit. And that is not going to happen if the private sector does not see the tangible benefit. It's not going to happen if you don't have the adequate mechanisms for those tangible benefits to be communicated, and if we don't have the right tools to have these benefits to be delivered in a sustainable way and in a business-oriented manner. So having said that, I think that we need to define productivity in terms of greenhouse gases, because if we look at greenhouse gas emissions, in many instances, in agriculture at least, we see the production of greenhouse gases can be considered as inefficiencies of the system. Why do I say that? Because let's take nitrous oxide, one of the greenhouse gases more common in agriculture production. Greenhouse gas production by nitrous oxide. Nitrous oxide is nitrogen that didn't go to produce protein, didn't go to animal growth, didn't go to plant growth, didn't go to productivity. So nitrous oxide represents nitrogen that we paid for to put in the system. We not only didn't get the profit out of that nitrogen, but we contributed to greenhouse gas emissions and global warming. Same could be said about methane in animal production, in certain plant production like rice, in which that methane that is produced by the system is carbon that didn't go to plant growth, to animal growth, and to productivity. So if we make systems more efficient, we offset carbon. And that's the concept, that's the theory. But how can we go from theory to practice? And that's the challenge we are facing in agriculture. Going from theory to practice means putting out systems that would demonstrate this concept. And I would like to share the Costa Rican experience, just an example of what can be done. We have programs in low-carbon coffee. We have programs in low-carbon livestock, in which we have proven with data, with results, that we can offset carbon without compromising productivity, increasing the system's efficiency. For example, by reducing fertilization, nitrogen fertilization, but putting the nitrogen just in the right moment, that reduces the amount of nitrogen needed, keeping the same productivity, reducing cost, and reducing nitrous oxide production. We have data that show that there is a negative correlation between methane production and animal productivity, because there is better digestibility of pastures, there is less movement of animals. If we have improved pastures and small paddocks, the animals gain more weight and produce less methane. We have better water use, and through these systems, again, we can increase production and reduce cost. So we make the systems more efficient. But as I said before, to implement this, to scale this, to make private sector interest in this, we need for these results to be communicated. We need the private sector to come and they want to do it. And so we have put this in pilot projects. We have involved the growers in an early stage. So we have trained more than 3,000 people in this kind of concepts with data, with results. And they're doing it in the field at a small scale now, but we have to have a mechanism to increase that. And how does that happen? Because we have put also financial stimuli. We need to put financial mechanisms. And let me tell you an anecdote. We have a banking system called the Development Banking System, and they came up with a plan for livestock financing, and they were financing the traditional livestock. And we had the Minister of Agriculture said, no, we need to change. We need to finance the transformational processes. We had to explain to the people in the bank these processes that I'm telling you about. And when they were convinced, they put together a financial mechanism. That just occurred this year. We have no results then, but we think that this is going to encourage the private sector, the growers, the cattle raisers, the ranchers to engage in this kind of low-carbon cattle production. So that's the kind of things that we need to really pursue. We think that we need to take, looking at the road ahead, take concrete steps towards achieve very concretely the Costa Rican, for example, the NDCs. We have to work together, Minister of Agriculture and the Minister of the Environment, in order to achieve this, and bringing, as I said, the private sector. We are very confident that this is going to happen because there is already a lot of interest in this. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks very much, Minister, and thank you for keeping to time. I mean, what a wonderful phrase, without compromise. Increasing productivity without compromise and making it climate smart for private sector. Brilliant terminology. What we'd like to do now is to share a couple of concepts with you as we warm up our panel for their interventions around a number of set questions that we have. So I've been asked to give a couple of slides on some perspectives of how to engage with the private sector. Could we have the first slide, please? Great, so engaging with the private sector. So at the beginning, most of the interaction between climate and private sector actors in agriculture was in the input side and the farmer group side. We then progressed to the aggregator side, and more recently we've progressed to the processing side. But there's a missing group, and we'll come to that at the end of this presentation. Public goods. So governments and public sector agencies and public sector financing support these because they're worthy, they're non-rivalry, they're supposed to be inexhaustible, they're meant as the trigger to give signals to private sector. But if something's a public good, it's kind of, our biases come back in and we see it as, well, if it's a public good, it's got to be a private bad. And something that's a private good must surely be a public bad. And collectively, we've got to find ways of undoing some of that prejudice and bias to look at ways of better linking public goods with private interests. It's not a bad thing, and we have to reframe some of our own thinking on this. Secondly, much of the public sector work that private sector is looking to join up with is funded by overseas development assistance. It's about $135 billion a year. But ODA is actually not development, because for every dollar in ODA, there's $3 in remittances in developing countries, there's $6 is in foreign direct investment in developing countries, there's $24 in private sector, domestic private sector spend in developing countries, and there's $35 in developing country government spending. So yes, ODA may remain a large revenue for much of what we do in agriculture innovation and trying to engage value chains, but it's not development per se. And we've got to use those linkages between public and private financing in a much smarter way. There's a number of benefits of engaging with the private sector, access to information, access to expertise, and you can read them a whole lot faster than I can rattle them off. But those are just some of the reasons of why we want more to actively engage, Diane, with the private sector. And just to balance it, I also put some risks of those, and and made sure that there were fewer so that we didn't have, again, a bias that there's more risks than benefits of engaging with the private sector. But it's not all a cherry pie, if you like. But those private sectors, and that missing part is also the financiers. So groups such as the French bank BNP Paribas are interested in sustainability and financing private sector to engage more in agriculture particularly. They're one of the key partners in the Tropical Landscape Finance Facility, launched a year ago, a $1 billion loan fund that is working in Indonesia just on renewable energy and landscape transformations. A fantastic example of trying to trigger some of these new investments and bringing in new capital to areas where we've really kind of thought, well, agriculture is a bit messy. And we've overestimated the risks, underestimated the returns, and overcomplicated much of our analyses and perception of it. And so this concept of blended finance, of linking credit and grants and equity through different actors with farmers and involving all of those players, and indeed often the off-takers who can be the ones who can pay back even loan facilities. So you can have loans, yes, Margarita, you can have loans dressed up as grants that are paid back by a third party. And in this way, we can de-risk smallholder farmers if these are put together by, obviously, professionals and an aligned, integrated approach. With the private sector seeing that, wow, this can de-risk some of our investments if we step in and co-locate, co-design, co-invest around these key activities. CTA and OECD led just over a year ago a fantastic workshop on innovative partnerships for agricultural finance and financing at large scale. So taking a lot of these climate agricultural solutions and taking them to scale. And on the second day, we broke into two groups. And there was one group, the grant financiers, and their conclusion at the end of their 2-hour session was, we've got so many viable project ideas, but so little finance. And the credit financiers went in another room, and their conclusion at the end of the 2 hours was, we have so much ready finance, but so few viable projects. And the reason was that different metrics and different performance standards were being used to evaluate those opportunities. And we've got to align those much better if we are to get meaningful blended finance. And so what's that missing piece in the middle? It's likely going to be, groups such as like Moringa Fund, the Livelihoods Fund, and CDC. Because this is where the leveraging power of that private sector capital to combine with grants and equity and investments are already planned are going to transform the way much of the scaling up is going to happen in agriculture. Thanks very much for listening. Great, and so we jump to our panelists, and they've each got a couple of minutes to introduce themselves and to give their different perspectives on the role that private sector can play in climate action and agriculture and contribute to the NDC goals. So let's start perhaps as we go down the line here. Margarita, as I announced earlier, is IFAD's director. Now, if you could just introduce yourself to us and give us from your perspective the role that the private sector can play in climate action and NDCs in 2 minutes or less.
Thank you, Tony. Well, Tony described me as the institution that gives loans dressed up like grants. So that's not quite right. But through the smallholder, we have the largest adaptation program for the smallholder agriculture in the world, which covers 42 projects in 41 countries. And what we have tried to do is through ASAP, which is all grants, through blended with our loans, is to ensure that private sector is part of the work we do. But it's important for me to highlight that for us, a small farmer is a private sector, is part of the private sector. And that is part of the issue we have here when we talk always how to link with the private sector, how we define private sector. Because when we have micro enterprise, like we have in Kenya, for example, producing biogas, it's a group of smallholders, of innovators that got together with our support and started a micro company. So for us, that is the first step of a private sector. But we go, of course, to the partnerships that, for example, we have with Mars, or the work we support to our smallholders to work with Carrefour. So it's very important for us, and we know it's not possible. When we talk, Tony mentioned the ODA, and for $1 on ODA, 35 goes into public expenditures from the developing countries. But only 2.5% of that goes into agriculture. So if we expect agriculture to be funded by the multilaterals, the bilaterals, and the public sector, we would be all dead. We wouldn't have any food to eat, and the climate would be just even worse than it's now. Therefore, just to make the point that without working all together, from the producers to the consumers, all of us in that value chain, we are all part of that chain of private sector and the role we have to play. Thank you.
Thank you, Margarita. And it's always a pleasure to have her on a panel because she keeps us all on our toes. Your Excellency, your perspective on, you summed it up without compromise, but just in a soundbite or a couple of other soundbites, your perspective on the role of private sector leaping into some of those low-carbon coffee, low-carbon livestock opportunities you mentioned.
Yes, we need to bring in all these results, all this data into action, leap out of academia into the private sector, leap out of the government actions to the private sector. And I think they have a very important role, but they, as I said, need to be convinced. We need to put the financial mechanism. Things have to be profitable. Examples are many. Having trees in pastures, for example, will increase milk production and also offset carbon. And there are many, many ways. There's no one fit for all. Depends on the system, depends on what crop, depends on what latitude you are in. But the thing is to adopt the concept that, as you said, no compromise. Mitigation can lead to productivity. And if we can finance that concept, then we think the private sector will do this, and then things are going to scale up. Instead of being small plots, we need upscale of this concept so that many people doing this, it would help really in achieving the Paris Agreement goals.
Great, thanks very much. Formulani, bring us back down to earth with Farmers Union's perspective.
Thank you, Tony. For us, we see a role sitting here representing smallholder farmers and all large farmers and farmers across all the spectrums. I think the private sector joining hands with the public sector, particularly when it comes to investments on climate infrastructure, which by its nature requires heavy investments, which will need a long time to have a better payback. And also because of the nature of the investments that are required, we will need people who can absorb some of the shocks while waiting for the payback. That's one area which is also critical for the private sector participating in this area. Another area would be incentivizing those who are producing in a climate-friendly manner, like we see in organics and fair trade. Why don't we pay a premium? We can create a market which is some climate sensitive in a way and encourage those who are producing to actually be sensitive to the environment. Another way where we think the private sector can play a critical role will be in the development of appropriate solutions, like insurance, for instance, if you look at bundling solutions instead of just offering one service. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Fumalani. So Matthew, although you don't represent any individual company, you represent a whole group with the World Business Council on Sustainable Development. So obviously we would imagine you would be pro-private sector, but any particular words of wisdom?
I'd also like to state that people recognise the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, but I'd also like to raise awareness of the Global Agribusiness Alliance, which was a new initiative formed last year, which looks at only producing organisations, and I'm also the director for that program. So I just want to raise awareness of WBCSD and the GAA. So in response to the question, what can the private sector bring, what's the role of the private sector, I would think scale is one of those things. When we look at Tony's chart there and we see Carrefour on one side and the input providers on the other, I think what we see in WBCSD is an opportunity to link all of those companies in initiatives. So what we've done, thanks to the leadership of organisations like Kellogg's and our partners CCAFs as well, is bring the whole value chain of companies to the agricultural solutions. We recognise that, the goals of productivity are as much those of the input providers as they are of the traders, as they are of the retailers. The goals of greenhouse gas mitigation are as much those of the retailers as they are of the producers as well. So we're aligning those interests around climate smart agriculture, where we now have quite a core of companies that are bringing scale through the value chain and business solutions to the agricultural space. And those business solutions, I would say, roughly fall into spaces of finance, of innovation, of capacity building, and of technology. And of course, those are 4 of the 5 areas that are targets for SDG 17 for partnerships. So we feel that we're able to bring a lot more than just NDC thinking, but also SDG thinking to our climate solutions.
Thanks. Now, before the session, we were having a couple of dialogue amongst some of the panellists, and Margarita shared with us that she was a perennial realist in looking at issues, or a serial realist. And Diane described herself as a serial optimist. And obviously, coming from Kellogg's, you'd have to be a serial something. But Diane, can you share with us some of your perspectives from a serial optimist?
Very nice, Tony. Thank you very much. And thank you for having us here today. As a Kellogg company, we rely on resilient food systems in order to have a business. So working at the intersection of food security and hunger and sustainable agriculture, these aren't just nice things for us to do. These are actually very critical to ensuring that we have a business going into the future. And we wanted to demonstrate that this was critically important to us and that we were supporting the NDCs actually at Paris in 2015, when we stated publicly our commitments to reducing greenhouse gas emissions out to 2050 using science-based targets that incorporated not just Scope 1 and Scope 2 in our own operations, but Scope 3 as well. And that was hugely challenging because not only were we not sure how we were going to get there to a 65% reduction in our own Scope 1 and 2 emissions, but certainly we needed innovation, technology, and real partnership to achieve a 50% reduction in our Scope 3. So what does that really mean for us? We rely on these ingredients. We rely on these farming communities who are both, through practices, contributors to greenhouse gas emissions, but I think far more importantly, extremely challenged by climate change. So in order for them to be resilient, we need to play a role in trying to identify the types of tools and partnerships and market access information that will make those farmers, big and small, more resilient. So we actually also have a commitment to support improved livelihoods for 500,000 farmers around the world through implementation of climate smart agricultural practices, so that we're focusing first and foremost on yields and on resilience, as well as on the types of practices that help to contribute to greenhouse gas mitigation and reductions across the systems that we all share. You know, it's great to see agriculture spoken at so much here at the COP because our food systems fail faster than many of the other targets that we address here.
So we've got 2 more rounds of questions for our panel, and then we're going to reserve 20 minutes for interaction with the audience, because it's terrible coming to these meetings and not having a chance to engage or just listening to others. But the questions are going to ramp up in intensity and controversy, if you like, a bit as we go through these next 2 rounds. And the organisers have asked me to be a little bit provocative in the questioning, and so I apologise in advance if I can't quite read all of Bruce Campbell's handwriting. But Margarita, you'd mentioned that IFAD has this $300 million smallholder, the ASAP program. It is the largest climate finance for smallholders. And you mentioned Mars and Carrefour that you've engaged. But you know, what were those opportunities with the benefit of hindsight you would have grabbed earlier?
Well, I think one of the big issues is trust and speaking the same language and ensuring that everybody benefits from it. I think it was very clear, the message from the minister, that obviously the private sector is there for a gain. But also the smallholders are there for a gain. They want to move out of poverty. So then it means all of us have the same objective. So what I see from the discussions we have with the bigger private sector is we want clear rules of the game. We want to make sure that the policy environment will help us buy from the smallholders that are really producing in a resilient manner. Because the problem now, everybody gets the same price, no matter what efforts you are making to produce in a resilient manner. Then making sure that there are reforms, national reforms and regulations that allow for these public-private partnerships. Because the donors are all telling us, work with the private sector, but don't give them any money because they produce their own money. So it's to identify in which areas the private sector requires our support. I think something very important that was mentioned here is infrastructure. What is the role of the private sector in infrastructure? Shall we fund the infrastructure? And of course, somebody from the private sector will build the infrastructure. We are not the ones building the infrastructure. But that will facilitate the access to the markets, ensure that the produce will get to where it should get. Then co-financing these public partnerships. I think in our case, we always talk about the 4 Ps, because for the partnership, we need the producer, the public, the private sector, to have a real partnership. So we want in these public partnerships, we have, for example, the work we have done in Nigeria with Olam and Nestlé. So it shows that when we assist, I think World Business Council had a very important point on the capacity building. We need the produce to be done in a way that somebody will want to eat it and buy it. So that is part of the effort we are making to ensure that that produce will get to the market at the quality that we need. And also promoting youth, agri-entrepreneurs. We need the youth to be part of these companies and private sector companies and micro companies.
Great, thanks very much. Minister, Costa Rica's ranked 61st in the world in terms of doing business by the World Bank. How can agriculture help boost you up that list?
Well, the doing business environment is actually one that has to do more with the enabling environment for business. So the doing business actually is more a task that we need to do at the government level to reduce some of the problems. But bringing this topic to what we're talking about now about climate, we think that there are sometimes so many regulations for agriculture that in a way, people that do things right have to pay to prove it. You know, if you produce organic, you have to pay a consultant to prove that you're organic. If you do sustainable agriculture, you need some kind of way to prove that, and that costs you money. I think that's something that I'm not going to give the solution. I'm just putting it as food for thought that maybe the system is backwards in stimulating climate smart solutions because actually those who do it right end up paying for their certification instead of being recognized because they do things right.
That's interesting. Both of our first two speakers in this round have spoken essentially about trust. So, Fumalani, how can we make sure that the private sector-led climate actions in agriculture are farmer-centric and that farmers can trust the other private sector actors, the SMEs and the larger aggregators around lenses of climate and productivity and stability?
So firstly, farmers themselves also have the responsibility to proactively assert themselves, to get involved in the design and implementation where they have an interest in the climate actions. Again, we also like to see the private sector being obliged to consult with the farming community, also in the design and implementation of climate actions. I think that's critical. We cannot do that without talking to each other. Regarding the lens through which to engage farmers, we'll definitely go for the profitability lens. And then inscribed in this is the productivity as well. I mean, there is no doubt that everyone, regardless of your scale as a farmer, you need to make more money from what you're doing. So profitability should be the angle through which we approach this. Thank you.
Matthew, you mentioned not only the Global Alliance of Agribusiness, but your work in WBCSD. The Climate Smart Agriculture work is being rolled out in a number of areas and regions, both developing and developed, Ghana, North America, ASEAN, India. In terms of those specific countries, how prominent was NDC thinking in the rolling it out? Is that something CEOs wake up in the morning and say, gosh, memo to self, got to remember the NDCs?
No, the answer to that is, I would say, I'll frame this by saying that 3 years ago at Lima, we didn't have a climate smart agriculture program. We didn't have a fresh program. So in WBCSD, we have a food reform remind me, Diane, what does fresh stand for? Food reform for sustainability and health, right? We've now got the largest traders together in a soft commodities forum. And we also have the Global Agribusiness Alliance. None of that existed. And it was Paris that was the catalyst to bring a lot of the agricultural companies together. We had some great leadership from our member companies and said, we really do need to take the lead on agricultural emissions and also the opportunities for agriculture to play its role in mitigating climate change through sequestration activities as well. And so it was Paris that brought them together. So that's sort of pre-NDC thinking. So I would say, Tony, that it's more like agriculture recognising it really needs to step up and that really does have solutions to climate change. I think that was one of the things that Paris brought around was agriculture is a solution to climate change. And so the NDCs give life to some of those solutions. And when we look at NDCs for mitigation and adaptation, we certainly see climate smart agriculture as the best way in which we can meet those objectives whilst making sure that we maintain or improve productivity. I would also say that the SDGs were also key to bringing about collaboration in agriculture because people recognise that agriculture, perhaps more so than any other sector, actions in climate change will have broad benefits, actions in water, actions against hunger will also have mitigation and adaptation benefits as well. So I would say it was probably the culmination of the SDGs and the Paris Agreement that really galvanised the private sector to action.
Not very often that you hear an Australian saying we're playing catch up, but thank you for admitting that, Matthew. Sorry, as a Kiwi, you've got to get these jokes in when you can. Diane, much of the talk so far has been about production. but consumption, as we know, is equally important. And, you know, Kellogg are showing a lot of leadership in this area, and including reducing greenhouse gas emissions from that. Now, what was Kellogg's perspective? Was that enlightened self-interest? Do you think you can bring other actors along? What's the space and the vacuum that we have to fill on the consumption part of the equation?
You know, food waste and loss is one of the biggest contributors that we have to the risks in our food systems as a whole. It means that the food that farmers are producing is either being wasted at post-harvest, it's being lost post-harvest because of lack of storage or transport or market access, or it's being wasted somewhere along the ways. And one of the biggest places that it's often wasted is post-store, right, at restaurants, in consumers' homes. So these were things that we definitely wanted to take action on. It's completely linked within the Sustainable Development Goals. SDG 12 is sustainable consumption, and within that, 12.3 focuses wholly on reducing food waste and loss all the way along that chain. One of the things that we're doing is we're really driving metrics and change at a post-harvest loss standpoint. But that's not the question you asked me. You asked me, what are we doing at the consumption end? One of the things, there's two things that we've done concretely to take action in that space. One is that there tends to be a lot of confusion by consumers on how long is food safe to eat or good to eat. How many of you look at labels and try to figure out, can I still eat this? Right? Driving consistency around labeling for best if used by is a huge opportunity space. And that's one where we stepped in to lead. Within the US, we found that we actually had numerous different ways actually of saying the same thing. And as part of the Consumer Goods Forum, who's driving transformation around food date used by labeling, we took the lead in saying we're going to transfer all of our labels to best by the specific day, so that we're eliminating confusion. And that gives us consistency on the shelf for everybody. We already have about 40% of our products converted, but that's just a US example. That exists in other places. In some countries, it's clearly legislated, in others, it's not. The other thing I would just add quickly is that the packaging sizes matter a lot. And so ensuring that there is not too much sold, like 2 for 1, you know, and reducing size to what is most likely to be consumed. That has different implications based on the type of market, obviously, because cost accessibility is key. But these are all things that we take into account as we're thinking around what role can we play in helping to ensure food waste is reduced overall.
Great, thanks very much, Diane. There's a lot of nodding in the room of the difference between best before, best by, and used by. Yeah, great. So we come to our third round of questions, and then we're going to have 20 minutes of interaction with the audience, a quick summing up from the organisers, CCAFs, and then I'm allowed to share with you that there will also be a cocktail and a small, some small bitings afterwards for those who have the stamina to stay with us for another 45 minutes. So we come to our third round of questions, and maybe we can start in reverse order this time, Diane, so that we're not having you at the tail end. But Kellogg's is committed to achieve 100% renewable electricity by 2050. It's fairly ambitious. Looking across your whole supply chain, how do you envisage this transition to renewable energy occurring with and engaging smallholder farmers in that whole value chain?
One of the things that enabled us to make that commitment was, well, there was really two things. One is that we have these commitments out to 2050 aligned to the NDCs that are science-based targets. We knew we needed to make that transformation. But the other thing was the enabling policy and enabling infrastructure, importantly, that allowed us to move just this year alone 20% of our purchased electricity to renewables, 100% here in Europe, as well as a big chunk in the US as well. That's transformational for us. What does that mean at the farm? That depends on country, that depends on what that infrastructure looks like. And it's not a one-size-fits-all, and I think, Minister, you spoke to this already. I'll share an example in Bolivia where we were working with quinoa farmers who were in communities that were not on the grid. And actually what drove the renewables solution that we were able to bring forward there wasn't the fact that they did not have electricity. It was the fact that weather patterns were changing. And as we worked with them to understand what were their needs and what would help them most from an environmental standpoint, a yield production standpoint, without expanding production, looking to intensify, they said, well, the rains aren't coming at predicted times anymore, but we have no ability to irrigate. So working together with our supplier and with other partners, we were able to bring solar panels to those communities with the intent to be able to provide micro-irrigation at point of most need, which actually had a remarkable result together with other agronomic support that we were able to gather with the village leaders and agronomists who knew those conditions specifically to improve their yields significantly. But it actually had other carryover events because for the first time, the kids could stay and study at home. They didn't necessarily have to go to the next bigger town and spend the week there to be able to be at school. Women who were, this is both good and bad, I will say, shouldering most of the work in the homes were able to work later. They said that was a good thing to us because it made their day. That's open for debate, but it gave them more flexibility, which I think was what they were actually speaking about. So these social benefits need to be taken into consideration, the gender importance, the community importance, and how that contributes to broader resilience. So it's having multiple beneficial impacts and not unintended consequences are things that was part of what we thought through as I share that specific example with you.
Great, thanks very much, Diane, and thanks very much also for bringing in the very important dimension of gender and that particularly differentiated role as we seek to progress. Matthew, there's over 120 agricultural certification standard schemes, etc. There's such a wide variety to choose from. How can we ensure consistency that we're actually measuring results and measuring performance, both from private sector and government actors?
Yeah, I think you've identified there that there have been a proliferation of standards, and hopefully we have reached, peak standard at 120 or wherever that you've named there, Tony. And what we are seeing now is a recognition that many standards overlap. So an announcement last week, I don't know if people are aware of this, was that the HCS and HCV have come together on a joint approach whereby there will be a single a manual whereby you can go through both procedures at one time. Oh, high conservation stock, high carbon stock, high conservation value, high carbon stock. Sorry. For forestry, and obviously that impacts on a lot of our agricultural supply chains. So we're starting to see this convergence, thankfully. Now, what the NDCs could potentially do is proliferate standards. When we talk about carbon, it could well be that we have, as we do now, an Australian standard, a New Zealand standard, a Canadian standard. What we really need between the governments, such as we've seen with river basin management, integrated approaches on how to manage and report carbon. And that requires probably a transnational boundary way, logical boundaries. That could be on a river basin scale, it could be on a commodity type landscape scale, but we do need consistency so that business can invest in NDCs. And a barrier to that consistency would be, if you're in Cote d'Ivoire, there's one standard, in Ghana there's another standard, in Nigeria there's another standard. So we do need to make sure that it's not just corporates and governments reporting, but governments and corporates are able to help in this standardisation. And through standardisation, we're able to maximise the amount of money that can go into mitigation and adaptation and also reduce that administrative burden. So open architectures around emissions trading, Article 6, I think, is something that we would strongly support. And there have been some extremely encouraging developments in the Canadian schemes and in Australian schemes and in New Zealand schemes where farmers and graziers are benefiting from farming carbon. And we would think that farmers in Southern Africa, farmers in Latin America, who are undertaking essentially the same practices, why shouldn't they also benefit from a carbon price and to be able to sell their carbon into open markets? So we would see a greater inclusion of opportunity for the smallholder farmer to enter those markets as being one of the things and one of the ways corporates and government can harmonise standards to improve financial flows into adaptation and mitigation.
Great, thanks very much, Matthew. So, for Melanie, as you know, knowledge is power. And we haven't heard much about ICT this afternoon and how ICT can enable farmers with that knowledge to take the best decisions around resilience, around making sure that they're bulletproof to some of the climate shocks. How do you see ICT and business models helping scale up climate-smart agriculture in Southern Africa?
Again, the beauty about ICT is the ability to reach wider and more larger numbers of farmers at the shortest time, maybe at the least cost. However, for that to happen and for us to be able to scale up any ICT-based solutions, we will need massive investments or rather expansion in network or connectivity infrastructure, so that we are able to cover wider geographic areas, even those who are in far-flung areas where the majority of smallholder farmers are. And we also need to see the costs of data and the cost of, for instance, insurance. If you talk about agriculture insurance, we will need to see that reducing so that there's more uptake, because the products will be more affordable for the users. And there are also existing promising solutions that have been developed, even in our region, in one of our members, where they use a bundled solutions. If we expand more of those models, we are more likely to see more uptake and wider uptake by farmers. And lastly, there's also a misconception by farmers on insurance. We will need to invest more in the awareness raising of the importance of insurance. Usually farmers see this as a cost and not as a way of, buffering themselves from risks that they will be faced with related to climate change. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. They're flashing a card. Thanks for Melanie. They're flashing a card that we've got to jump to the Q&A session, but let's briefly ask the Minister and Margarita as well. Firstly, Minister, Costa Rica is known as very quality agricultural produce. You export a lot. You've got a lot of progressive companies. A lot of the action has been done already. How do we bring the mainstream, everyone else who's not a leader in their field, along with this private sector and climate-smart agricultural focus? The majority who haven't yet seen the light.
Okay, we think about some of our main export sectors. They're not working still in climate smart production, but there are opportunities within waste management, for example, to produce energy, and that can bring in other companies, not necessarily the producer, but other companies, other entrepreneurs that use waste to produce valuable products, whether it be energy or other products like fiber or chemicals or fertilizer or whatever that can be produced out of waste from agricultural systems and produce new products. The other thing that is we need to look at is the role of suppliers of inputs for the farms, whether it is biological or whether it is fertilizers with lower emissions, or whether it is other inputs that can really transform agriculture. So I see opportunities also in the input companies that can produce those inputs that are climate smart. So, but also we need to reproduce the lesson learned in those systems that have that we already have results, and going to the banana sector, going to the pineapple sector, look at the sugarcane sector and other sectors that, but we need to work, again, government, funding agencies, and the producers in order to achieve this.
Great, thanks very much. So lastly, Margarita, before the Q&A, after some prompting at the beginning, we eventually admitted we were all capitalists, albeit natural capitalists and social capitalists and financial capitalists. But in your work at IFAD, those co-benefits of developing enterprises where you see social capital as one of your key dividends, how important is that in your investment thinking and investment decisions?
I would say that is always one of the main objectives of our work. I was mentioning in the beginning the case of Kenya, where we helped this small microenterprise to develop the biogas system, the flexi biogas system. And now we have helped this small company to export the technology to Rwanda, to Mali, to India. And what we have seen is the impact this has on women, how much this producing energy changes the life not only of the women but of the children. How, for example, now we have seen benefits with the harvesting, the post-harvesting facilities now that are insulated. Now we have the drip irrigation that is using this electricity. We see how women now are spending more time in looking into ensuring that the food is more nutritious, the way they prepare the food. So the benefits, the co-benefits of supporting these small enterprises has been amazing in every way. Now we have this network of different countries, different stakeholders from Asia to Africa working together into generating these ways, new ways of microgrids of energy with biogas. So that is only one example, but you would find in many, many of the IFAD investments that we have similar approaches to ensuring we develop social capital. Thank you, Tony.
Great, thanks very much, Margarita. And thank you to everyone for staying in the room. We haven't lost many people. Oh, sorry, here's one person stands up. No, we weren't singling you out. No pressure to stay. But thanks very much for staying. We recognise it's a bit hot in here and the oxygen levels aren't that high, but indeed, thank you for staying. And now's the time for a bit of quick Q&A from the audience. So we're going to have a number of rounds. We'll ask 4 or 5 questions and then pose them to the audience. You can either ask a general question or you can ask one specifically to a panel member. We don't want long interventions. We don't want narratives, sharp questions so that we can all share. And typically when we start Q&A sessions, it is grey-haired, elderly, white gentlemen like myself that dominate the microphones. So given Diane reminded us that we do have a gender framework to address also at this COP, they would like to have the first round of questions to the female members of our audience. A microphone, please. And men, we will get to you in the second round. Just be patient.
Hi, Gabriela Burian, Monsanto, co-chair of Climate Smart Agriculture 2. My question is for all. How can we scale up good experience that you all have been sharing with us? Thank you.
Very sharp. Wow, that sets a standard. Other questions? How to scale up? Ladies, please don't be shy, otherwise you'll make me look foolish. Well, more foolish than I am, as Bruce laughs.
I think the same goes for ICT. My name is Patience. I'm a community developer from Zimbabwe. We hear success stories from Africa, but in remote areas at a very small scale. There's need now to standardize so that we don't continue having small success stories, but people can have a platform where to purchase proper ICT for poor farmers. Thank you.
Great question. Thank you very much. 2 or 3 others? You're letting our panel off the hook. We want something quite... Thank you, madam.
Thank you. I'm Lena Weingartner. I work with the ODI in London. I have just a quick question around the point on insurance that was mentioned earlier, and mainly looking at microinsurance for farmers. And I just kind of wanted to raise the question also, since Matthew spoke a bit more about value chains, and to see where you think actually there's potential for risk financing across the whole value chain, given that in a lot of instances it seems that the risk is actually put on farmers where it's not necessarily always theirs to own.
Super question, thanks. And one more?
Hi, Hannah Simmons, Climate Smart Group. I was sitting in another session, and it was a bunch of financiers, and they said, we're lacking bankable projects. So how do we actually have this action?
Great, 4 super questions. Who would like to? Let's start at that end. Diane.
Okay, gladly. Scale is really important, and I will be frank, it is one of the larger challenges that we face, precisely because it is hard for farmers to test new practices because they only have 1, maybe 2 harvests a year to support their entire family, and that puts tremendous risk on them, as has been raised, to think about how that gets changed. But we have seen successes, and that really comes through how we engage the Ag Extension and trusted advisors in understanding what climate-smart agriculture, water-smart agriculture practices look like that are relevant to their soil, their water availability, and their crops. And where we've found that we can scale learnings with the crop advisors or extension teams, we've been able to move quickly. We've covered several thousand women in cocoa in Cote d'Ivoire, where actually the issue was, how do we get women even to the training, given they weren't represented, but yet they are the primary workforce on the cocoa plantations. We've seen it with several thousand potato farmers in Bangladesh as we're expanding work there. How we then map that across different countries is a matter of continuing to do that. But this issue of finance is a critical one. And I think there's both a appetite for risk and an appetite for speed. And we're still trying to unlock that. So we welcome all kinds of support, and there's a couple of specific places where we are looking for that. So we're hopeful it will come.
Great. Matthew, which questions did you want to dodge?
On the scale up, I think what's important to note is when we look at the private sector also has extensive relationships with NGO groups, and I think it's working through our NGO partners as well in these more multi-stakeholder collaborations. I mean, Gabriella, you work very well with Conservation International, for example. We have WWF as partners, our colleagues here at CCAFS as well. So I think it's the private sector and NGOs and farmer organisations and these multi-stakeholder approaches that really enable us to scale up. And yesterday, in one of our panels, we had an intervention from Landcare who talked about the need for investment in social infrastructure to scale up, because without that these scale-ups will never occur. To the question on from the lady from ODI in London there, I didn't catch her name, but you've got Ivan sitting two rows in front of you there, and you'd probably better tap him on the shoulder about insurance rather than me. I'm asking Ivan to help us on this very question. But certainly we want to see more climate-related and climate risk-related insurance, and how payments are made to the farmers. It's often in the transactions and the trust, and again that comes down to building that awareness around insurance products. And we know there are many insurance products out there, so it's not a question that there aren't insurance products. It's making sure that they are climate-smart insurance products, and certainly we're seeking to work with insurance companies on that. The other question there was on from Hannah was on how do we get the investment? I think packaging these investments, and I think it's hard for us to get to that investor sweet spot. And if you think of that sweet spot of being that sort of $50 million to $100 million, it's quite difficult when you go out into the field and package things up to that level. And then it's hard for those investors then to find a counterparty that meets the credit risk profiles that they have. So it's the question of scale, and then does the counterparty have the credit risk to meet that scale? So there's a couple of obstacles that are there. We launched a fund, it was 2 weeks ago now in Mexico City with Rabobank, UN Environment and WBCSD, which is around bridging that gap between what is commercially viable and where there needs to be some cushioning of risk. So if people are interested in that, we can certainly provide further information.
Great, thanks very much, Matthew. So for Melanie, you have a colleague here from Zimbabwe who mentioned that scaling up the ICT, particularly in those rural areas, is a challenge, and you mentioned it was least cost and fastest, and how do we reconcile that coverage, incomplete coverage?
Okay, thank you. I think another biggest contributing factor to the scaling up, particularly on ICTs, if you look around, there are so many solutions. And then how do farmers know which solution to take? And most of them may not even be comprehensive. I think maybe we need to move away from, just developing solutions without thinking thoroughly about what they have to offer. I think let us consolidate those that are working properly, because people get confused. There are so many products out there. Some may not add that much value to the farmer. So I think that's one of the hindrances. And the cost as well, we sometimes assume that it's cheap, of course, relatively than moving physically, is cheaper. But the cost of data, for instance, is quite huge compared to developed countries if you look at our regions. And the issue of assumptions that people make in the solutions that they develop, smart-based, internet-based solutions. Not all farmers, they may have smartphones, but most of them might be hand-me-downs, which are not compatible with the latest software. So that's what we've also seen in the field in some of the work that we've done. I'd also just like to touch on for instance, the bankable projects. People may say they lack bankable projects. That's a fair point. But if you look, taking it from a farmer's perspective, there might be opportunities to develop projects, but the capacities that exist, even in farmers' organizations, to come up with bankable projects is a challenge that we face and we see. Ideas might be there, but packaging those in a way that will be acceptable to the funders is a different story. Thank you.
Thanks. Minister, any reactions to the questions?
Yes, I would like to integrate two questions because I think they're related. One is how to scale up, and the other one is the lack of bankable projects in climate-smart agriculture. They are related because actually the key to scale up is actually having bankable projects in climate-smart agriculture. So we need to have or do the job with the banking institutions in order for them to finance climate-smart agriculture projects. But again, if people don't have the information, don't have a system that works to mitigate, adapt, and produce efficiently, then we cannot prepare a cash flow for a bankable project that can be presented to a bank with a good table of spends and results and all the things that need to go in a bankable project. So we need to do that. And in order to also have this availability of banking funds, there are schemes that can be carried out by growers' organizations that in which small loans, and we are doing that in Costa Rica, growers' organizations are a mechanism that, at least for small loans, the banks can trust because they know the people in their community, they know that somebody is a good worker, they're honest, and so on. And that helps leverage small funds, small loans to workers, and that can also be a tool that can be used for scaling up climate-smart agriculture. But again, the key is having the information both at the producer level and at the banking level.
Great, thanks very much, Minister. Margarita.
Thank you, Tony. I would say that I agree with the idea that for upscaling we need money. That's obviously very important. But I think that the way we are approaching it with not so much money is the South-South cooperation and the South-South exchange. The example I was giving from Kenya, for example, to bring this technology to Mali and to Rwanda and to India and to show smallholders that this works, what are the benefits? and having the smallholders themselves say what are the benefits for them. I think that helps us upscale very easily. And we have seen this in many regions when we have learning routes. For example, we just organized one in Bolivia, bringing smallholders from different parts of Latin America to exchange what they have done and how it's working. Because sometimes the smallholders are ready to even take loans themselves from the national institutions to upscale themselves when they see there is a benefit. We also need capacity building and obviously knowledge management tools. So it's not just about money, but it's also other ways, alternative ways to upscale. And just two pieces of information. We have, we are the secretariat of a facility for agriculture risk management that is known by acronym FARM. And this is funded by several donors, but our work right now is to really analyze risks in agriculture in several countries in Africa, to try then to help the countries face those risks. So that's a very interesting sort of approach to risk, which includes climate risk. The other element that I think is important, we are also working on insurance for agriculture, including climate insurance, working with microfinancial institutions at the national level. And again, we could provide you with more information, more details of our work in this area. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Great. We still have time for a second round of questions, so raise your hands, please. We have two in the front here. And our second person leaving the room.
I'm the first one holding the mic, so I'll jump on that one. I would contend that I'm Ivan Bio from Farm Africa, and another organization that uses the acronym FARM. We're an international NGO. We work in Eastern Africa, largely with smallholders. And I would contend that there is another missing link in all of this in support of Margarita's statement, and that is what we refer to as the kind of first mile in the value chain, the first mile in the market. It's where the smallholder meets the market. And the smallholder producer meets the market, and this is the market which is composed of the small agri-dealers. It's composed of the small traders who are taking produce with their motorbike from one place to the other. It's composed of the son and the daughter of the smallholder who provides a service of spraying crops when there are pests, etc., etc. And this is the part of the market that is crucial to make the link to eventually to the Kellogg's. And this is the part of the market where it is so hard to get finance. First of all, the local banks who we work with have the same problem about not having bankable projects because none of these small-scale operators can
Ivan, can you try and turn it into a question?
Any due diligence process. So my question would be largely to Diane, really. How could the large business, the large corporate business, and the large bodies of finance help out at that kind of local level in building up that due diligence, in building up the business capacity, in building up the access to finance at the local level?
Thanks. Two at the front here.
Thank you. My name is Salome. I'm from Liberia. I've actually saw this post-sort, a business advantage and scaling up agriculture. I've actually I work with rural communities and working to introduce climate smart agriculture and helping farmers to scale up from sustainable farming to kind of more business-oriented farming where farmers are able to improve their livelihood. It has somehow been difficult because, access to funding for farmers is a very difficult issue in Liberia. Right now, we don't have any maybe loan for agriculture. There is no agriculture loan. Most of the financial institutions that are involved into microfinance have their interest rates very high, and the local farmers are unable to access, those opportunities. The collaterals, are very huge. So when I heard Margarita and our Excellency speaking about microfinance and loan to farmers, and I got very interested to know how have this worked in your country, and what have been the kind of impact on the farmers, so to speak. Thank you.
Great. We got to the question in the end. Thank you, Madam. The gentleman behind.
Thank you very much. I wonder if any, I'm Jeff Skier from the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA. I wonder if any of the panelists could comment specifically on the potential of agroforestry and the value chains associated perhaps with nitrogen-fixing wood crops that would perhaps increase the food crop yield while also providing additional value chains in terms of reduced nitrogen oxide emissions that was mentioned, and also a value chain of wood for energy use, which might reduce the depletion of local forests. And then also, are there any particular challenges associated with scaling up agroforestry approaches that are in addition to the regular issues that Diane described?
Great. Take two more.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed that session. My name is Barend Erasmus from South Africa. So far, the discussion started off in the beginning saying that we're all capitalists, but we did mention in passing things about social capitalism. But the rest of the discussion has all been about increasing profitability. And my question is, what about other ways of measuring value? Thank you.
Green accounting. Good.
Hello, my name is Frederick Baron Welch. I work with Earth Alive Clean Technologies in Canada. I have a quick question primarily about value chains. So, as a small Canadian company, we have some product that we would like to introduce to Africa, but what we've discovered is that it's often very difficult to create the supply chains necessary to actually move this product into the areas where it's necessary. So, we're able to ship a container to a port, but the price multiplier is essentially perhaps making it either unavailable once you get into African countries, or the price has gone up by 300, 400% because there are so many middlemen involved. And some companies with large enough size have essentially been able to get around this by building their own supply chains all the way out into communities, but that's only an option for very large companies. So I'm wondering if there are any comments on that. Thanks.
Great. So on the program, we've got responses from the panel to those questions and also some final remarks from panelists. And I'm going to ask our panelists to try and condense your responses to those questions and weave in your closing remarks. So we'll give you 10 nanoseconds to prepare for that. But can you, let's do justice to the questions that have been asked, but also give us a little bit of a closing statement and your thoughts on, for those who like Twitter and social media and other sound bites, what's your closing thought for us as we come away from today? Would you like to kick us off, Diane?
Sure. Let me first pick up on Yvonne's question about this last mile. It's or first mile, actually. We kind of look at it the other direction, but it's the same thing, and it's hugely challenging. So as we've looked at this, we've really taken a look at the middlemen, which was already raised, and how many there are, and how do you shorten the string on that. And as we've invested, and I think I mentioned the potatoes example in Bangladesh where we've been scaling up. We're looking at this in Nigeria with some programs in India as well. We're driving transparency through our suppliers on where all the costs are picking up. But equally, we're looking at where milling partners are placed and what the mill shed is that will feed our business directly, and how we play a role in directly engaging in that mill shed, because it really shortens the line of people involved. And through that, then we can actually help support improved post-harvest storage, where then access to market is more negotiable up to the farmer, not just at the time of when the person comes around to collect their yield. So just a couple of quick examples, and in the spirit of being tight on time, I think that we've covered so much territory here on how we really scale agriculture and make it climate smart. And this is critical for all of us. Every single one of us here depends on that for everything we enjoy in our foods every day. And we all have a role to play. We've covered so much of that across the conversation. But we rely particularly on smallholders and women in that chain. And so the steps that we take particularly to focus on how we connect them to finance, to training, to markets, to companies like ours is something I think we're working on and we value partnership in, and each of us can take action on.
Thanks. Matthew.
I don't know whether Jeff from Irina's question was a plant from you, Tony, or a plant from Dennis Garrity, but yeah, the concept of evergreen agriculture is one that we want to adopt within the Climate Smart Agriculture Program. I mean, people always talk about the demand for food increasing. The demand for wood is expected to triple in the same time. So we do need to provide sustainable sources of wood, and the way modern forestry is going is the old school wall-to-wall forest plantations are probably societally unacceptable, and the way we do things now with new plantations is to integrate them more holistically into landscape. So we certainly see a lot more work in that space, and if you were interested in taking the discussion further, the Global Alliance for Climate Smart Agriculture, GACSA, would certainly welcome Irina as a member, and we could take that discussion forward there and perhaps join us in December the 12th in Rome at the annual forum. I'll leave it there because I think other people might want to have some other comments. Thanks, Tony.
Great. Phumlani.
Quickly, just a small comment, a short comment on the other ways of measuring value. Yeah, indeed, we should not only look at profitability. I mean, it's a public good that we have a sustainable environment. At the same time, I think we also still need to link it with profitability as an entry point. Regarding my final remark, I think the problem is too huge for just one party to concentrate on. I think we cannot run away from joining hands for the private sector and the public sector and everyone else involved to come up with sustainable solutions to address the problem. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Honourable Minister?
Yes. On the issue of scaling up, the agroforestry issue is a very important one in the systems we have been working with, will be the coffee and the livestock. The combination of trees with with the main production system really has benefits not only in offsetting carbon, capturing carbon in the trees, but also there has been productivity effects that have been documented. Like, for example, when temperature rises, the animals tend to get under the shade, which is cooler, and the productivity increases even by 10%, and that has been documented by one of our research institutions. So that's one way of increasing productivity. That's an adaptation, also strategy, and it's a mitigation strategy. So that's one of those climate smart agriculture that can certainly be scaled up because it really has benefit for the farmer. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. And Margarita, in 1 minute, could you just sum up the progress over the last 23 COPs?
Nice. I think Liberia needed a response first. So I think we have a lot of very interesting experiences I would like to share with you later on. But basically, what they have asked us is help them identify the risk, measure the risk, so that they can lend to smallholders. So we are doing that in many countries. We have a lot of experiences so that they feel they can give loans and insurance knowing what is the climate risk that their investment is addressing. So, but it's a long story, so I'm not going to do it here. But the conclusion, but now after 23 COPs, is that private investments are instrumental to really help countries achieve the NDCs for mitigation and adaptation in agriculture.
Super, thanks.
Join in. is going to be something very strange.
Great, thanks very much. Remember, if agriculture was a country, it would be larger than China, India, Canada, and USA all put together. It would have 3.5 billion inhabitants. It's responsible for 25% of greenhouse gas emissions. And, you know, with some cynicism, many people say, well, we've had 23 COPs, and what has happened? And the only thing that's ever agreed at these meetings, are two things, and that is the date and venue of the next meeting. But in agriculture, I think we can credit CCAF's, the program for advancing climate change in agriculture and food security for raising the profile of agriculture and here connecting it with business. And we'd like to ask the director of CCAF's, Bruce Campbell, to deliver some closing remarks and setting out a way forward and some thoughts on scaling up the private sector. Bruce.
So Tony's given me all these challenges, and actually the greatest challenge for me was right at the start when I met Stephanie, and she said she really enjoys going to the NGO community events because the NGOs have got such passion. So I'm going to try and prove Stephanie wrong by giving you some real passionate completion. So the challenge is that we believe that you have to transform the developing world. I'm Zimbabwean, and we often do participatory type stuff, and I'm going to ask the audience to help me summarize what has been said through a Zimbabwean war cry, which is Pamberi na something, which is forward with. And I know there's a few Zimbabweans in the audience, and I'm expecting them to help. Otherwise, it'll fall flat. And if there's not enough Zimbabweans, then I expect the Zambians and the South Africans to chip in. So, Pamberi na food security. Pamberi na blended finance. Pamberi na social capital. Pamberi na Costa Rica. Pamberi na serial, what was it? Serial optimist. So I better be a little bit serious because I am a director of a research program. So we really do believe that there's going to have to be a massive transformation in the next decade ahead. And we've kind of put together a vision of what we think is transformational. And one of the cornerstones of that is public-private partnerships. So I think this kind of event is fantastic. But of course, it's only one cornerstone, and we don't want to forget the social capital, the extremely strong farmer organizations which must drive the process, and the other pieces of it. But public-private partnerships is really crucial for scaling up. I think Tony's introduction was fantastic in terms of the kinds of private partnerships, the public-private players we need to work with, and he's pointing out that the finance community is really missing often from our work. And I think even if I can speak on behalf of the international research centers, which I'm not really allowed to do, I guess, but I think that that's a real missing research piece as well, is that we spend too much time on the technologies and not enough on these things which are going to make change happen. And one of them is research about the financial models, the financial instruments that will work well. There's another easy way to summarize, actually, is through Twitter these days. I've been watching the Twitter stream, and there's a whole lot coming out from Margarita already. And it's in terms of the public-private partnerships, the linking, the trust, the building the same language, getting finances in the audience is really important. I'm not going to say anything more. Thanks very much. And especially thanks a lot to Tony. And I give the last word to Tony.
Thanks. So we have 2 minutes left on the clock, and so one last thought, and then before we thank and show appreciation to our panel, And the first thought is vocabulary. So please do join us for a cocktail outside and share and come up with common vocabularies. 3 years ago in Royal Society in London, there was a landscape financing meeting. And it was a very unusual meeting because although there were 150 participants, about 100 of them were financiers and bankers. And the other 50 were NGOs and researchers and universities. And in the morning session, we came out with that the number one issue on the table to discuss in the afternoon was equity. And to your point as well. And so after lunch, Peter Wheeler from TNC was moderating the session. And after about 10 minutes, we realized there was a real disconnect in the room because the bankers thought of equity as capital and the NGOs thought of equity as equality. And yet we were using the same word and yet we were talking past each other. And in that regard, for those of you who do like Twitter and would like a little quote, perhaps from this session we've seen that action and alignment trumps rhetoric and discord. So could I ask you in closing to show a very warm round of appreciation to our very stellar panel.